Most people think they know what Native Americans ate. They don't. Some meals took an entire day to prepare before anyone could eat a single bite. Others depended on a harvest that lasted only a few weeks, but had to feed a family through an entire winter. And some of the most important foods looked, at first glance, almost impossible to eat. There was never one Native American cuisine. Hundreds of nations lived across forests, deserts, mountains, rivers, and coastlines, each shaped by a different environment. So a fishing village on the Pacific coast ate almost nothing like a farming community in the Northeast, and neither resembled the buffalo hunters of the plains. What they shared was an idea rather than a diet. Food was knowledge, responsibility, and months of preparation, and every meal carried the place, the season, and the labor that came before it. Wild rice and whitefish. Every late summer, families across the Great Lakes returned to the same lakes for a harvest that would help decide whether the coming winter was manageable or painfully lean. One person guided the canoe through the rice beds while another bent the stalks over the boat and tapped them with a wooden stick, so the ripe grains fell like rain while the rest stayed for another day. That was only the beginning. The rice still had to be parched over a fire, loosened from its husk in a hide-lined pit, then tossed in birch bark trays so the wind carried off the chaff before it was finally boiled with whitefish from the same water that had grown it. Missing the harvest didn't just mean a different meal that week, it meant facing winter with far less than the family needed. The Three Sisters? Long before anyone had a name for companion planting, native farmers had already worked it out. Corn, beans, and squash weren't grown separately, but together because each helped the others survive. The corn stalks gave the beans something to climb, the beans returned nitrogen to the soil, and the broad squash leaves shaded the ground and slowed the weeds. In autumn, dried corn was ground on stone, mixed with beans and pieces of squash, and simmered for hours into a thick stew, sometimes with dried venison or fish added, sometimes left plain. It was simple food, but never unimportant. A poor harvest could shape the whole year that followed. Not every staple came from a field, though. Some of the most essential foods started out looking almost inedible. Acorn mush. Across much of California, oak trees produced one of the region's most valuable foods, which probably sounds unlikely to anyone who has tasted a raw acorn. Bitter enough in some varieties that eating them untreated is genuinely unpleasant. Generations of accumulated knowledge changed that. Acorns were gathered by the thousands each fall, cracked open, and ground into flour on stone mortars, worn smooth by centuries of the same motion, then leached by pouring water through it again and again, sometimes for most of a day, until the bitterness washed away. What remained was cooked into a thick porridge inside tightly woven, waterproof baskets, using heated stones lowered directly into the mixture, since the basket couldn't sit over a flame. A food that started out nearly impossible to eat became one of California's most dependable staples, and patience mattered as much as the acorns themselves. Smoked salmon. When the salmon returned to the rivers of the Pacific Northwest, daily life changed almost overnight. The runs lasted only a short time, and every fish that came upstream mattered. Fresh salmon might be roasted on cedar stakes beside the fire, but everyone understood the real work started once the feast was over, since hundreds of fish still had to be preserved before the run ended, split open, cleaned, and hung on wooden racks above slow-burning alder fires, the smoke settling into the meat, the clothing, and the wood of the smokehouses for days at a time. It wasn't only about flavor. A strong run meant shelves filled for winter, and a weak one could change everything. Pemmican? Long before canned food existed, there was pemmican. Simple, portable, and remarkably effective. Lean meat, often buffalo, elk, or deer, was dried until almost all the moisture was gone, pounded into a fine powder, and mixed with hot rendered fat, with dried berries worked through it in many regions. Packed tightly into rawhide bags, it stayed edible for a long time, traveled easily, and needed no cooking, which made it essential on long journeys and in seasons when hunting failed. Nobody ate it because it was exciting. They ate it because it remained something they could count on when almost everything else had become uncertain. Not every important source of protein walked on four legs. Sometimes it arrived in enormous swarms. Roasted grasshoppers. In parts of the Great Basin, including among Paiute and Shoshone communities, grasshopper swarms brought opportunity rather than panic. Groups of people spread across the landscape and slowly drove thousands of insects toward prepared pits, then roasted the catch until crisp, eating some right away and drying the rest into a coarse meal for later. It probably sounds strange to an outsider, but in a dry landscape with few dependable food sources, it made complete sense. The insects were rich in protein, easy to preserve, and available in numbers almost nothing else in the region could match. Blood soup? Few meals surprised outside visitors as much as this one, not because it was unusual, but because of what it revealed about how completely a successful hunt was respected. Among several Plains nations, very little of a buffalo went to waste. Meat, fat, hide, bones, sinew, organs, and even the blood each had a purpose. The blood itself was prepared into a thick soup, sometimes combined with organ meat and wild onions when they were available. It may look unfamiliar to modern eyes, but the logic was simple. When a single animal might feed a family for weeks, throwing away anything nutritious wasn't really an option. Hominy and squash blossoms? One of the most important discoveries in native agriculture wasn't visible in the ingredients themselves, but in how they were prepared. Across much of the Southwest, dried corn was soaked and cooked with wood ash or lime, a process known today as nixtamalization, which loosened the tough outer hull and made its nutrients easier to absorb. Without it, a corn-heavy diet could cause serious deficiencies. With it, corn became one of the most reliable staples in the world. The finished hominy was boiled into soups or ground into dough, while squash blossoms were picked early in the morning before the heat could wilt them and cooked soon after. None of it was complicated, but all of it was carefully timed to the rhythm of the plants. Then for many nations, everything changed. Not because the land stopped providing, but because people were no longer allowed to live from it. Government rations. By the late 19th century, forced removals, shrinking hunting grounds, broken treaties, and the destruction of the buffalo herds had left many families dependent on food issued by agency posts, instead of the harvests and hunts their ancestors had built over centuries. Flour, coffee, salt, sugar, hardtack, and tough beef that needed hours of boiling before it was edible. None of it was food people had chosen. It was a substitute for a system deliberately dismantled, and families adapted because there was little else they could do, though adapting was never the same as thriving. Fry bread? One of the best-known native foods today carries one of its most complicated histories. Fry bread didn't exist before reservation life. It grew out of necessity once government commodities began including white flour, lard, and salt, and a rough dough fried until golden turned those plain rations into something warm and filling. It appears today at powwows and family gatherings, carrying two histories at once: resilience and identity for some, a reminder of hunger and displacement for others. Even before reservation life, though, survival had always come down to one thing above all: the buffalo. Buffalo and prairie turnip stew. A successful hunt was never the end of the work, only the start of it. Meat was cut into strips for drying, fat was rendered, bones were cracked for marrow, and hides were scraped and prepared, with very little left behind. Fresh meat often became a slow stew with prairie turnips dug by hand from the grassland. And before metal cookware arrived through trade, some communities boiled it by lowering fire-heated stones into water held in hide-lined pits. One good hunt could carry a family for weeks. One bad season could reshape the whole winter that followed. As autumn faded, meals grew quieter across these different worlds, not because food mattered less, but because nearly everything that could be preserved already had been. Dried meat hung safely away, corn filled the storage pits, smoked fish rested in the shelters, and the last fresh melons and vegetables were eaten without much ceremony. The hardest work of the year already behind everyone. Winter still to come. Looking back, it's easy to see these foods as unusual. To the people who prepared them, they were simply life. Breakfast after a morning gathering wild rice, supper after a good hunt, a pot of stew waiting after a day tending corn, beans, and squash. None of it was created to impress anyone. It was shaped by rivers, forests, deserts, and generations of knowledge passed from one family to the next, knowledge later disrupted by removal, disease, and policy, but never fully lost. Wild rice is still harvested, salmon is still smoked, and families still make fry bread, carrying the history it holds. These meals were never just recipes. They were a way of understanding the land, and for countless native communities, that understanding remains one of the greatest sources of strength they have ever had.